What's up, my channel? It's your friendly neighborhood sassy blonde writer coming at you with another writing video. It is National Poetry Writing Month, so we are gonna have some more videos about poetry. Today, we are talking about how to refine and edit poetry. Now, I know when I first thought about doing this video, it seemed kind of weird to me, and I don't really know why. So my first thought was, how do you edit poetry? Which sounds weird because on one hand, it is a form of writing, so you should be able to edit it. But poetry always feels so personal and introspective and subjective. So how can you really edit something? Like editing a diary entry. But I mean, that's kind of the thing, isn't it? You can't edit a diary entry, can't you? If the phrasing isn't so good. Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Anything can really be edited at any point, right? Editing and refining poetry, of course, is different than editing and refining, prose. Different than editing your novel or editing an essay or a short story, because it's a different form of writing. And this is something that I don't think really gets covered a lot. I struggle to think of a time in my life where I was being taught about poetry and writing poetry and also told how to edit poetry. I figure, I struggled to figure out how to do this. Somebody else out there probably was too. So here I am. Today we are going to talk about how to refine and edit poetry. Before we begin, please subscribe to my channel. I post new videos on Wednesdays. Now that that's out of the way, let's get started. So, how do we edit poetry? If you listened to my last video, that was an introduction into poetry, I talked about the differences between poetry and prose. And again, the difference between the two really relies on the economy of language. And as I said, the difference between a prose writer and a poetry writer is a prose writer will try to use pretty much every word available to them while they're writing. A poetry writer, on the other hand, tries to use as few words as possible to get their point across. Their concern is not so much about how many words they need to get on the page. Their concern is about the impact each of those words has. And so, while you are editing your poetry, that, along with some other stuff, is what your main focus needs to be on. And so I think with that in mind, these other tips will definitely help you on your poetry writing and editing journey. While you are editing poetry, just keep these next couple of tips in mind. So number one, definitely focus on meter and rhythm. There's always a comparison between poetry and song lyrics. For some reason, I find a lot of teachers tend to say, song lyrics are like poetry. Thing is, song lyrics are poetry? It's not a comparison. It's an equivalent. Song lyrics are poetry. Don't get me wrong. Some song lyrics are better poetry than others, but they're the same. Just song lyrics are set to music, and poetry's not always. But anyway, so I find editing poetry is kind of like editing music, where you have to consider rhythm and meter and the flow, or how everything flows together while you are editing it. And if you're musically inclined, that will definitely help you while you are editing it. I find that poetry is best edited while reading aloud, or at least either reading aloud, or if you're not alone, at least muttering it to yourself, so that way you can hear how it sounds out loud. Because the thing is if phrasing sounds awkward in prose, you can get away with it. If something sounds awkward in dialogue in a script, you can kind of brush it aside. If wording sounds awkward in a poem, that could be a deal breaker when it comes to publication. Again, poetry is like writing song lyrics or rapping, where the words have to flow together in some way, or else it won't work. This is even more important, especially if you're using a rhyme scheme, and especially if you're using a specific type of meter, although modern poetry doesn't really follow a specific type of meter, like iambic pentameter, like your Shakespeare's days, but that's beyond my scope of knowledge. But if you're using a type of rhyme scheme, then you will have to follow some type of rhythm, so that way you can end on a certain rhyme to get there, so that is definitely something you will have to keep in mind while you're editing it. So you will have to maybe delete a word or change a 2-syllable word to a 1-syllable word, or a 1-syllable word to a 3-syllable word, so that way you can keep the rhythm going or change the lines around. If you are just starting to get into poetry, I highly recommend that you use a rhyme scheme first. Having a rhyme scheme will help you notice any changes in rhythm in your poem. It will just help you notice if you have any flaws, help you notice where your issues are. If you're just starting out, if you start right off the bat with freestyle, it's gonna be difficult to notice where your poem needs work, especially with meter and rhythm. It's kind of like training wheels, and you may feel like that's stifling your creativity or whatever, but you gotta crawl before you can walk. Free verse is fun, but it doesn't have much structure in it, and it's harder to realize what you need to work on when you don't have a structure that you're supposed to be following. So when you're editing, read it aloud or quietly to yourself, and note on the page what lines have a different rhythm compared to the one before and the one after. Why is that? When you were doing this, it's helpful to have a thesaurus handy, so that way you can keep the integrity of what you're trying to say in the line, but you can make sure that the rhythm will match when you're changing out the words. Also watch out for if you have a natural flow that's happening and then is interrupted by either a hard sound where you need a soft sound, or you have a hard sound like a hard consonant where you need a soft sound, or a word with too many syllables or not enough syllables. Do you have natural alliteration or assonance or consonants? Hey, we talked about that in the introduction video. Why don't you check it out if you need a refresher. That you want to develop, and if all the words start to sound like gibberish, take a break. Once words stop having all meaning, however, take a break. Go for a walk. Go get a cup of coffee. Don't look at anything you wrote for a little bit. Tip 2, use a thesaurus. Thesaurus is your friend. Again, you want to build your economy of words, and so another difference between poets and prose writers is prose writers tend to put things in the simplest terms possible, whereas poets tend to try to simplify into one word if possible. So developing a vocabulary using a thesaurus is one of the perks that you will develop as you're editing. So either keep a thesaurus handy if you're an analog person, or just keep that thesaurus tab open on your computer while you're editing. And don't be afraid to play around with using different words, changing your word choice, etc., etc. While you're editing, because finding the right word will impact your reader's experience. So you want to make sure you find the right one. Don't be afraid to take risks. Also, when you're in the editing phase, if you don't like how the word looks, just erase it. Undo. It's no big deal. Another thing you want to look out for, third tip, keep an eye out for imagery, simile, and metaphors. So every piece of imagery in your poem should have a point. You shouldn't have a piece of imagery there just for the sake of having it there. It should have a point. You should also have some type of cohesive imagery throughout the piece. So look for patterns and images, help direct interpretation. So if your poem, for example, was about feeling like you are a wrecking ball in all of your relationships, and like you come in like a wrecking ball, don't all of a sudden throw in a comparison of being a sledgehammer or a ghost of some sort. That will confuse the reader. It'll be like, wait, I thought you were a wrecking ball, but now you're a ghost? Wait, which one are you? I'm confused. I hate poetry. That will literally be the reaction. Make sure that your metaphors are, make sure that all your imagery is consistent, or if you change your imagery, it's intentional. I think that's the best way to put it. If you do change your imagery, make sure it's intentional and not just you did it by accident because you forgot. Also, keep an eye out for literal images that you can do with the spacing of the stanzas and the lines and everything, because there are different like cool things you can do with the spacing for poems. Like visual poetry is really cool. Sometimes a little complicated to do, and I don't know how people do it. Look out for visuals, in your poem, like within the text, but also literal visuals that you're creating with the text, if that's what you so so choose to do, and like spacing with your stanzas and everything. If you're breaking up your poem into different stanzas and changing ideas, just make sure that that's consistent. Do any images collide? Also keep an eye out for repetition. Do any lines repeat? Like for example, still I rise. She has the line still I rise repeating throughout the poem. Would the poem make any sense if she forgot to include it at some point? No. Maya Angelou probably went through that poem with a fine-tooth comb and made sure that she repeated the line still I rise after each stanza, because that made sense for the poem. So just make sure if you repeat any line that it is intentional, that you, one, repeated it on purpose, and two, remembered to repeat it. 5. Who do you picture as your speaker for your poem, and who do you picture as their audience? Who are they talking to? Are they talking to a close friend? Are they talking to somebody who hurt them? Are they talking to themselves? Are they just talking? Keep these things in mind while you are writing. People talk to different groups of people in their lives differently. You know, the way you talk to your parents is probably different than the way you talk to your significant other, I hope. And the way you talk to your boss at work is probably different than how you talk to your friends. So just keep that in mind. For when you're editing your poem, you want to make sure you have a consistent tone. We already kind of addressed this one, but tip number 6, watch out for wordplay, alliteration, assonance, and puns. You want to make sure that those are happening intentionally. We already talked about that a little bit in the beginning, but just keep an eye out for those. If you have the opportunity, make sure you develop it if you want to take advantage of that. Also want to make sure any ideas that you have within the poem, you develop them properly, you have a direction. That's all I have for you today, folks. Those are my 6 tips for editing and revising poetry. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up so that way I know you want more content like this. I enjoy doing these videos on different areas of writing outside of novel writing. I think it's good to talk about the different ways you can become an author for authortube outside of just novel writing, and I enjoy talking about poetry as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please remember to like and subscribe, and of course, happy writing and happy poetry writing.